Chapter 5. After a quick breakfast of bacon and eggs, Benjamin and Emily drove out to pick up the girls. She was feeling extremely shy on the way out to his parents' house after everything they'd done together in bed. The silence was worse than talking though, so she asked, "Is there anything in particular you want me to fix for dinner tonight? Or do with the girls?" She stared straight ahead as she asked the questions, unable to look at him. He thought about that for a moment, thinking the way she wouldn't look directly at him was adorable. "I don't care what you make for dinner. As long as I'm not eating my own cooking, I'll feel blessed." He squeezed her hand as he drove down the dirt roads through the countryside. "As for what to do with the girls, I'm not even certain what Anna did with them all day. Sure, I know she worked with them a little on their letters and numbers, and kept up with the housework. Maybe work with them on cooking and baking. Anna always said they enjoyed baking with her more than anything." He grinned at her. "And you could always spend some time working with Georgie on her housekeeping skills." She smiled despite the sadness rushing through her. Every time he mentioned Anna's name, he said it with love. Someday, maybe she'd have his love as well, but for now she knew his late wife still had a firm hold on his heart. "I'll work with Georgie, and maybe we'll bake something." "That's a good idea." She also decided she'd go through the girls' clothes and see if anything needed to be mended. It was never too early to learn basic sewing skills. "What time do you finish work for the day?" "I lock the doors at 6, but sometimes need to stay longer to straighten things up. I open at 10 every morning. I like to eat lunch around noon or 1, so if you ladies could bring something down for me, I'd appreciate that." "Of course, we can." She wasn't sure what, because she'd had very little time to explore her new kitchen, but when they returned home with the girls, she'd look and see. "Some days I'll want you to work for me so I can eat lunch in the back room, or I may ask you to help me stock the shelves, but for today, you need to just get acquainted with the girls and learn about your new home. And cook. You can't forget to cook." She smiled thinking about his first letter. Anything but bacon. She hoped they had a good store of food, because she liked to have options when she cooked. She'd had to work under Mrs. Walters for so long, cooking whatever was asked of her, that she loved the idea of having total freedom in the kitchen. She liked to cook whatever she was in the mood to cook and not have to follow a specific menu. She was truly looking forward to cooking for her small family. He smirked, pulling up in front of his parents' house and setting the brake. "Yes, anything but bacon." He paused for a moment. "We also need to get you some fabric so you can start making some new dresses for yourself." He jumped down and helped her down to the ground before leading her toward the house. He opened the door without knocking and called, "More? Abby? Georgie? We're here." Abby and Georgie came running, followed by a straight-faced Ingrid. The girls ignored their father and headed straight to Emily to hug her. "What are we going to do today?" Abby asked. Emily hugged both girls tightly. "I thought we'd start by fixing lunch," she told them. Then she lowered her voice as if imparting a big secret. "We'll bake some cookies and take them to your papa at work." She raised her voice again. "We'll need to fix supper as well, of course, and someone needs to clean Georgie's room." Emily looked straight at Georgie as she mentioned her room, watching the little girl's face turn pink. "And we'll just spend time getting to know each other." Abby wrapped her arm around Emily, clinging to her. "That's the part I'm looking forward to." Her eyes were full of excitement at the prospect of spending time with her new stepmother. Benjamin watched his 3 girls talking together and sharing secrets. He turned to his mother. "I'm going to go out and talk to Far." "Is he in the barn?" He knew harvest time was over, but his father would still never spend a lot of time in the house. His wife would drive him crazy if he did that, so he could usually be found puttering in the barn or spreading manure over the fields for extra fertilization this time of year. "Yeah. Go to the barn with him. Be off with you." His mother shooed him toward the door, making it clear that men didn't belong in her house during the day. After she'd shut the door behind her son, Ingrid turned to the girls. "Run along and make the beds you slept in last night, girls. I want to have a little chat with your new more." Emily watched as the girls ran to the back of the big farmhouse and turned to her mother-in-law with a smile. She hoped the woman was going to offer to teach her to cook Norwegian foods for her new family. It would be nice if she could cook them the foods they were used to eating. "The first thing I want you to know is I do not believe my son should have married some woman he found through an agency. I had a delightful Norwegian girl all picked out for him who would have made him a good wife and who would have been a good mother to my grandbabies." Ingrid's accent was slight and musical to Emily's ears, whereas her new husband didn't have an accent at all. Emily felt her face turn red and was unsure how to respond to her mother-in-law. She'd done nothing wrong, but the woman obviously hated her on sight for being someone who she didn't want her to be. "I'm willing to learn to cook Norwegian foods." She mumbled the words, knowing they'd never be enough for the tall white-haired woman in front of her. Ingrid shook her head angrily. "You can learn to cook the foods, but can you grow taller and look like a Norwegian woman? Can you change your family history so you will know our customs and our ways? Can you become Norwegian?" "Of course, I can't, but I will do my very best to make your son and your granddaughters happy." Emily forced herself to keep her voice calm. She'd never in her life wanted to hit someone so much. How could her new mother-in-law be so ugly to someone she barely knew? Ingrid clicked her tongue. "Oh, I saw how happy my son was this morning. Obviously you know some bed tricks to keep him satisfied, but he needs more than a woman to warm his body at night. He needs someone who will help raise his daughters correctly and who will help them turn into strong Norwegian women proud of their heritage. How can a tiny little woman without a drop of Norwegian blood do that?" She glanced over her shoulder to make sure the girls weren't coming their way to overhear. "It would be best for everyone if you got back on that train and went right back to the east where you belong before my granddaughters start to love you. Already little Abby is calling you mama. You are not their more. Their more was a wonderful Norwegian woman who loved them. She does not deserve to be replaced with you." Her mother-in-law's words shocked Emily to the very core of her being. She'd been spoken to condescendingly, but had never lost her temper. This woman made her want to throw rocks. She'd come here planning to be the best mother and wife she could possibly be, and this bitter old woman had the audacity to tell her she wasn't good enough to be a part of her family? She struggled to keep her voice calm and low. "I'm sorry you don't like or approve of me, Mrs. Johnson, but I'm not going anywhere. I came here to be a mother and a wife, and that's what I'll do. I'm not going to turn tail and run back east simply because you don't think I'm good enough for your family." She walked toward the door, deciding to wait near the buggy. "Please send the girls out when they're ready. Thank you for watching them last night." As soon as she'd stepped outside and closed the door behind her, Emily made a fist and slowly released it. How could someone be so close-minded? If her mother-in-law thought Norwegians were so superior, she should have stayed in Norway. How could she move to another country and not expect even one of her children to marry someone from that country? How could she condemn her without ever getting to know her simply because she was not exactly like her? Did she need to be a cookie cutter of every other person around her? Emily desperately wanted to cry, but there was no time for that. Her girls didn't need to see her cry, and Benjamin already thought she was weak. There was no way she was going to add to that thinking. She stood next to the buggy waiting for the girls to come out and join her. She had no idea how long Benjamin would be, but it had been 8 when they'd left the house, and with an hour round trip, he wouldn't take more than 45 minutes if he wanted to get back to town in time to open his store. She could stand there waiting all day by herself if she needed to. Asterisk. Benjamin wandered into the barn and found his father squatting down trying to hold a board in place while he hammered a nail into it. "Let me help, Far." He took the board and held it while his father swung the hammer as he'd done many times in his life. "Enjoyed having the girls. You need privacy with your new wife, you bring them on out anytime." "Thanks, Far." His father, Sven, was a man of few words and always had been. Still, when something bothered him, his father was the first person he went to for advice. It's odd being married to someone other than Anna. Sven nodded. I can't imagine being married to anyone but you're more. Especially someone so different from her. You went from a tall blonde Norwegian woman to a tiny little thing with brown hair. Physically, they're as different as night and day. They're different in every way. Benjamin shook his head. Emily is afraid of her own shadow. She's not much of a talker either. Anna never knew how to stop. If she wasn't talking, there was something seriously wrong with her. He paused, searching for the right words. I'm afraid I'm going to break my new wife in half every time I touch her. Not that it had stopped him, of course. You're going to have to be a lot more careful when you're with this one. Sven finished hammering in the nail and got to his feet. Anna was a good wife to you, and I'm sorry she's gone, but you don't need your new wife to be just like her to have a good woman. Benjamin considered that and nodded after a moment. I know that, Far. She's just so, well, shy is the right word I guess. He chuckled for a moment. My poor wife hasn't had the courage to look at me all day. Sven gave a half smile. Well, that'll work itself out eventually, I'm sure. She loves the girls already, though. I've never seen Abby take to anyone the way she's taken to Emily. She's usually so withdrawn, especially since Anna died. I've been worried about her. Maybe it's good your new wife is a shy one as well. The two of them should do well together. If either of them can get a word in with Georgie talking nonstop all the time. Sven chuckled softly. That girl sure is like her more and far more. She's still talking herself to sleep at night? Benjamin laughed. She does. I sometimes hear banging on the walls, because Abby wants nothing more than to be left in peace and Georgie just can't seem to be content unless she hears the sound of her own voice. Sven slung an arm around Benjamin's shoulders as they left the barn together. You've got good kids there. Don't let anyone tell you anything different. Benjamin spotted Emily and the girls standing next to the buggy as soon as he got outside. Now why isn't Emily inside getting to know more? He walked over to the buggy and gave Emily a questioning look. Why does she look so sad all of a sudden? Is she missing home? Everyone ready to go? Benjamin asked, not asking the question that was foremost on his mind. Emily turned to him and smiled brightly. The girls and I are ready for our first day of getting to know each other. We can't wait, can we girls? She smiled hesitantly at Sven. It's good to see you again, Mr. Johnson. Oh, we're not so formal. Call me Far. Everyone else does. Sven patted her back. We'll see you at church on Sunday. You take good care of my granddaughters. I will. I promise. Emily bit her lip to keep the tears in. He obviously didn't feel the same way his wife did about her joining the family. His kindness made it all the harder to hold back the tears. Benjamin helped her into the buggy while the girls scrambled into the back. See you Sunday. He called to Far. Once they were on their way back to town, he took Emily's hand in his. He wasn't sure what was wrong, but something had obviously upset her. When she was ready to talk about it, he'd be there for her. Georgie chattered about how fun the wedding supper had been and what a good time she'd had at Farmore's. Farmore let us help bake bread and I got to make mine into a face and put raisins in for hair. Abby made a face. She put salt and pepper and sugar on it, too. It was disgusting. She leaned forward on the seat so she could talk to her new mama easier. I put sugar and cinnamon on mine, and when it came out of the oven I put on just a little bit of butter. It was delicious. Mine looked better. Georgie protested. But you had to throw it away. You couldn't even eat it. I didn't want to eat it. Then why did you take a bite of it before you put it in the slop pail for the hogs? Georgie humphed. I was curious, that's all. She suddenly spotted her favorite picnic spot. That's where I like to go on picnics, Mama. Right over there by the pond. Emily looked at the pond. That does look like a nice place for a picnic. We need to make sure we take one soon before it's too cold. She'd only been on a couple of picnics. Her mother had always worked 6 days per week and did household chores on the 7th, so she only got to go when a friend invited her. Tomorrow? Georgie asked. How about Sunday after church? Emily suggested. She'd never driven a buggy before, and she didn't want to try without Benjamin there to help her the first few times. Besides, she liked the idea of having the whole family there when they went on their first picnic together. Oh, could we, Papa? Georgie pleaded. Benjamin smiled over at Emily, pleased she'd made the suggestion. Well, if your mama wants to fix us a picnic lunch, then I'll be happy to eat it. Georgie clapped her hands happily. I can't wait. What will you fix for the picnic, Mama? Emily acted as if she were considering the most important question she'd ever been asked. I think I'll make some bacon sandwiches. But, you said you wouldn't do that when you wrote to us. You promised. Georgie sounded close to tears. Emily laughed softly as she turned and smiled at her younger daughter. I did promise. I was only joking. What do you girls like to eat on picnics? She wanted to cook things they were familiar with eating, of course, and introduce new things as well. Mama, our first mama used to just take bread and some cheese and cookies and lemonade. Could we do that for our picnic, Mama? Abby asked. Of course, we can. We can take anything you girls want to take. She thought about it for a moment. We can do some potato salad as well. Do you girls like potato salad? When there was no immediate response, Benjamin said, I don't think they've ever had it. I know I haven't. Really? I'll make some. We'll see if you like some of the dishes I'm used to making. She looked at Benjamin. Do you think Brigitte will teach me how to cook Norwegian foods? I really would like to learn so I can make you the things you enjoy. He shrugged, wondering why she hadn't asked his more. I'm sure she won't mind. She's a good cook. Not as good as Moore, but she's good. It might be easier for her to teach you with how much closer she is, though. He eyed her speculatively. He really didn't care if he ate Norwegian foods or not. He was just happy to not be eating his own cooking anymore. Well, once I've settled in, I'll ask her to teach me. I do know how to cook a great number of things, so hopefully I can keep everyone happy until I've had a chance for lessons. She was suddenly worried about her cooking, which was odd. It was the one area in her life where she felt like she was truly accomplished. Abby leaned forward again. I don't care what you cook, Mama. I'm just glad you're here with us. I am, too, Abby. She squeezed the little girl's hand which was resting on the back of her seat. Benjamin stopped the buggy in front of the house before helping Emily down. I'm going to put the horses in their stalls and go straight to the store. Will you bring me lunch today? Of course, I will. I may come down to do some shopping as well. I'd like to see the store. She took the girls by the hand and led them to the house, not nearly as upset as she'd been. The girls did wonders for her mood, and she was looking forward to her first full day with them. Benjamin watched them go, wondering again what had bothered her. He was glad she was happy again, though. It meant a lot to him that she wanted to see the store. He'd worked hard to make it what it was, and he wanted to be able to show it off to his wife. It was part of her life too, now. Chapter 6. Once she and the girls were inside, Emily led them to the kitchen. I know you girls want to do some fun things today, and we will, but first I need to get an inventory of exactly what we have in the kitchen so I can see what I need to get from the store. I want to be able to cook more than bacon sandwiches. She smiled at Abby. Do you know how to write? Abby shook her head. Mama was just starting to teach me when she got the fever. I'm sorry she died. Emily hated the sadness she heard in the girls' voices every time they mentioned their mother. She knew the sadness would eventually fade as they grew older, but for now, their mother's death was still fresh on their minds. We loved her a lot, but we're really glad you came to live with us, Abby said. The look on Abby's face was sad, but hopeful as well. Georgie was off in her room remaking her bed and tidying up. I'm glad I came here too. I get 2 little girls and a wonderful new husband. Emily thought about the best way to do things. Would you run and get me a piece of paper and a pencil, please? I need to make a list of what we'll need. She opened the pantry door to see what she had to work with. There was a bin of rice, another of beans, a tiny amount of flour, and a bit of sugar. She sighed. She couldn't do anything at all with this. She was so glad the store was right downstairs. Abby brought her the pencil and paper and she quickly started noting what she'd need. She couldn't make anything without more supplies. Even the beans would need some salt to make them taste decent, and there was no salt to be found. She'd need to bake bread and figure out what to make for a meal. She'd used the last of the bacon and eggs for breakfast. By the time Georgie came down from cleaning her room, Emily had a list she could work with. She turned to the girls. Do you want to go to the store with me? Or do you want to wait here? She had to go immediately if she was going to be able to cook something for lunch. Abby stood up. I want to go. Good. Emily smiled at her. Come on, Georgie. If Abby went, then Georgie had to go. Abby was only 6, but she could watch after her sister. Georgie was just too boisterous to be left on her own for even a few minutes. Georgie followed along behind, chattering away about the fun things she wanted to do. Abby led the way through the house and down into the back room of the store. Papa likes for us to come in the back way and not use the street, Abby explained as they walked. Emily wasn't sure that would hold true now the girls wouldn't be going there on their own, but she followed along. As they rounded the corner from the back, she saw Benjamin carefully counting out change. Come again, Mrs. Miller. Emily waited until Mrs. Miller turned to leave the store before saying, we didn't have enough food to do the cooking with, so I came to get some. I hope that's okay. She looked around the store in awe. She'd expected a small country store, but this was big enough to rival any she'd seen back home. The shelves were lined with canned goods. Barrels stood in the middle of the store with beans, rice, flour, sugar, salt, and many other staples. There were several different fabrics to choose from. Some had pretty patterns, and some were simple, serviceable fabrics. Everything about the store impressed Emily. She was proud of what her husband had accomplished here. Of course. What do you need? She handed him her list, which included a lot of staples as well as some meats. I'm not sure exactly what you have here, so I just made a list of the things we need most. Mrs. Miller turned around and looked. Oh, is this your new bride, Mr. Johnson? I'd heard she finally arrived. Mrs. Miller looked to be in her late 30s. She was short and plump with laughing green eyes and brown hair. Emily smiled at her and took her offered hand. You must not be related to Benjamin. Mrs. Miller laughed and shook her head. His family only makes up about half the town. There are others of us here. She held up her shopping basket. I need to hurry home and get started on lunch for my family. It was nice meeting you, Mrs. Johnson. I'm sure I'll see you at church on Sunday. Emily watched bemusedly as Mrs. Miller turned and rushed from the store. She turned back to Benjamin, who was filling up a crate with the things on her list. The girls rushed over. May we each have a piece of candy, Mama? Papa said we had to ask you. Georgie was, as usual, the one asking for them both, and Emily's heart went out to Abby. She understood how hard it was to be so painfully shy. Emily noted the line of jars on the counter with different types of penny candy. Each jar held a treasure of candy for anyone with a sweet tooth. Just one each would be fine. I don't want you to spoil your lunch. Benjamin added a bolt of cloth to everything else she'd asked for. It was a shade of sky blue that would match her eyes perfectly, and she loved it, but she was certain it was too costly. She knew instinctively he'd put it there for her to make herself a dress with. Oh, that's so pretty, Benjamin, but something more serviceable would be better for me. She loved the color and the pattern, but she knew the cost would be dear. He shook his head. This is for you. My wedding gift. He looked her up and down, noting her old faded dress. It will be beautiful on you. Thank you. She couldn't argue with him. It was his money, and he had to be proud of how his wife looked. If he wanted her to wear the blue, then she would wear the blue. He lifted the box, and realized then how heavy it was. How about you take just what you need for today with you, and I'll bring the rest home when I close up. She made a face. I'm stronger than I look. You keep underestimating me. She lifted the box, which was heavy, but certainly not too heavy for her to manage. I'll be down with your lunch just as soon as I get it cooked. It may be a little late. She would do her absolute best to get it ready in time, though. She didn't want to interfere with his regular schedule. Once they were back upstairs, she put the things he'd given her away, noting the meat she'd asked for wasn't there. There was just a small portion of salt pork. Where does your papa get meat? She asked. Abby shrugged. From the butcher. They trade. I didn't see a butcher shop. Of course, that didn't mean anything. The butcher could be outside of town, or he could simply be working from his home, where everyone would know to go with or without a sign. He's next door. He doesn't have a sign up. Papa keeps telling him he needs to get one so he can get more business. I see. Well, since we don't have meat other than the salt pork, I'm just going to make beans and rice for lunch. Is that okay with you girls? She hoped they enjoyed simple meals like beans from time to time. Abby nodded, and Georgie said, Yes, Mama. I'm not picky unless I have to eat bacon all the time. Emily found a big pot and filled it half full of beans and added water from the pump. I would rather soak them longer, but this will work. She set them on the work table and turned to the girls. We need to leave those to soak for an hour, and then I'll boil them. Do you want to help me bake some bread while we wait? She spent the next hour working happily with the girls, showing them just what ingredients to add to make the bread and how to knead it once it was mixed. Georgie wanted to make her own little pan again, so Emily agreed while she exchanged a look with Abby. Would you like to make your own as well, Abby? Abby nodded. I want to make cinnamon bread like I did at Farmores. It was delicious. I think that's a great idea. As soon as the dough is done rising, we'll make the bread. She thought about the other things she needed to do to get caught up. As much as Benjamin's mother angered her, she was thankful the woman had kept them caught up on the major housework. She glanced at the clock on the wall. They still had 30 minutes before she needed to start boiling the beans. We need to cut the salt pork for the beans. Do you girls know how to use a knife? She went to the work table and selected a knife for herself and two smaller, duller knives for the girls. Abby's eyes widened. Mama never let me use a sharp knife. Emily wondered if she was doing the right thing, but she thought if she watched over them, the girls would do fine. Well, I'll show you how to do it, and you have to promise to be very careful. Okay? The girls stared at her with wide eyes. I promise, Abby said. I will be careful, Georgie told her. She gave them each a small dull knife and stood one on either side of her at the work table. Georgie had to stand on a chair, but Abby was tall enough to reach on her own. She gave them each a small slab of the meat and showed them the correct way to hold their knives to cut it. She demonstrated the size she wanted for the beans, and they all stood cutting together. She did 3/4 of the amount on her own, but the girls did some. When they were finished, she put it all in a small pile. Now we need to drain the beans and rinse them, and then we'll add water. The girls watched as she showed them step by step how to boil the beans. Then she started a pot of rice to go with them. There. Lunch will be delicious. She walked to the table and checked on the bread, punched it down, and covered it again with a kitchen towel. She washed and dried her hands. We have the ingredients for sugar cookies or a yellow cake. Which would you girls rather make today? Georgie started squealing, jumping up and down. Cake. Emily looked at Abby. Would cake be okay with you, too? Abby looked at her sister and sighed. Cake is fine. Emily tilted her head to the side. Do you prefer cookies? Abby didn't seem pleased at the idea of cake, and Emily wondered if she ever got to choose what she wanted. Yes, ma'am. Well, let's let your little sister choose this time, but next time you get to choose. Would that be fair? Abby nodded, a smile on her face. It was obvious that because Georgie was more boisterous, Abby was used to giving in to her wants and needs instead of standing up for what she wanted. We'll bake the cake after lunch. We have about 40 minutes before then, but I don't want to leave the kitchen with the pot boiling, because it might boil over. Would you each bring me all of your socks here? I know that's a silly thing to ask, but I want to make sure they don't need to be mended. We'll go through all your clothes today, and see what needs to be mended and what new clothes you need. Georgie made a face but ran up the stairs to obey. Abby walked along slower, but she seemed to like the idea. They each came back with 4 pairs of socks. Emily had never owned more than 2 pair in her life, so she was surprised they had so many. It showed her just how wealthy her new family was. She went through each sock and found Abby had 1 pair that needed to be mended while Georgie needed every sock she owned mended. It made sense with the difference in the girls, though. George was certain to not be as careful with her things as Abby was. Emily had brought a small sewing kit with her and put it in the parlor where she was sure she'd be using it. She looked down at Abby. Would you run to the parlor and fetch my sewing kit? I put it on the table between the chairs. Before Abby could even respond, Georgie had run out of the room to do it. Abby's face fell. Emily hugged the child with one arm and said very softly, so Georgie wouldn't hear, Abby, you and I are a lot alike. We're both quiet and shy. I know it seems like Georgie does everything first and always gets her way, but I'm not always going to let that happen. I'm here to watch out for both of you. Abby had a tear in her eye as she hugged Emily. Thank you for being my mama. She sat down with the girls and pushed the bread dough out of the way, showing them each how to carefully mend their own socks, before getting up to check lunch. By the time she'd done 4 of Georgie's socks, Georgie had done 1 and Abby had done both of hers. It was time for lunch. We'll put this aside for now. I'm going to take your papa his lunch. Do you want to come with me, or do you want to eat without me? Abby stood up. We'll come with you. Georgie rubbed her stomach. But I'm hungry. Emily looked at Georgie. There's no one to stay with you since Abby wants to come with me. After putting a large bowl of rice and beans on a tray for Benjamin, she held her hand out for Georgie. Let's go. They took the same path they'd taken before, down the stairs and in through the back room. Once they were there, she stopped. Should I take the food into the front, or just let your papa know it's here so he can eat between customers? Take it to him, Mama. His customers know he eats while he works. They don't mind. Abby led the way, so Emily followed. She took the tray and set it on the counter behind Benjamin while he talked to a young woman in the store. 2 older men sat in the corner playing checkers. One of the older men called out, "Is this your new wife, Benjamin?" "She's a tiny little thing." Benjamin finished with the woman and turned to the men playing checkers. "Better to be a tiny little thing like my wife than an overbearing woman like your wife." Emily's eyes widened in surprise as she looked at the man to see how he'd react. Why would Benjamin talk to one of his customers that way? He threw back his head and laughed out loud. That's true. Very true. The man sniffed. Your lunch smells good. Better than the bread your mother brings in even. Benjamin put his arm around Emily's waist. My wife is a good cook. He gestured to the man at the table. The loud mouth over there is my cousin, Thomas. His friend is my brother, Samuel. They were both at the wedding, but I know you didn't have a chance to meet everyone. Emily smiled toward the men and waved timidly. She felt like she was on display and she hated that. Do you need anything else before I go back upstairs? She asked softly. She wanted to hurry away so she could hide. She needed to feed the girls, of course, but getting out of the room was even more important to her. I talked to the butcher this morning. I got some chicken for our supper. He indicated a wrapped piece of meat on the counter. Any day you want meat for supper, you tell me and I'll get it for you. We can have fresh every day with a butcher in town. She nodded. Thank you. She picked up the wrapped chicken from the counter and headed toward the stairs. Benjamin caught her hand. Are the girls minding you? Emily's face lit up at the question. They've been wonderful. I don't have a single complaint. We're about to eat lunch, and then we'll bake some bread for supper. His eyes searched hers. He'd worried a little that the girls wouldn't mind her because she was so little, she wouldn't seem like an authority figure. You would tell me if they didn't? Of course, I would. Our girls are wonderful. They do everything I say. Both girls nodded to emphasize her words, and he let go of her arm. Okay, I believe you. You go and have a good lunch. I'll be home a little after 6. She picked up the chicken and hurried out of the store and into the back room, going up the stairs with the girls to have her lunch. After lunch, Emily asked, Do you girls like chicken and dumplings? She'd always loved chicken and dumplings, and wanted to share the dish with the girls. The girls looked at each other. We've never had chicken with our dumplings, but we love dumplings. And chicken, Abby told her. Emily frowned. Well, we'll try it and see then. The three of them made the bread. Each girl was given a ball of dough the size of her fist to make her own bread with, while Emily made 4 loaves of bread and a dozen dinner rolls to serve with their chicken and dumplings. As soon as the bread was in the oven, she began preparing to boil the chicken. Once it was on, she boiled the water to wash dishes. Will you girls wash the dishes for me while I clean off the table and finish darning your socks? You want us to do the dishes? Abby asked in surprise. Emily wasn't certain what she'd said wrong. By Abby's age, she'd been doing the dishes on her own. Yes, would you wash so Georgie can dry? After the girls were used to doing the dishes together that way, she'd have Georgie start washing. They were certainly old enough to learn to do simple tasks. We've never done dishes before, Abby explained. Never done dishes? Really? Emily went to the sink and put the bowls they'd used for lunch into it. Just wash them until there's no food left, and Georgie can dry them. If you can't reach to put them away, set them aside and I'll do that. She mixed the rice in with the beans for another meal and covered the pot with the lid. She'd have to ask the girls how to get down to the cellar. She was sure there had to be one to keep the food cold, so they could store it for the next day. She darned the last of the socks while the girls washed the dishes. She was glad they were so eager to help, even when it wasn't something they normally did. They talked back and forth as they worked together, somehow not realizing she was listening. Mama never made us do dishes, Georgie said, a slight whine in her voice. Well, our new mama says we have to do the dishes, so we have to do the dishes. We're older now, and we can do them. Abby's voice was patient while she explained how she thought things should be. Do you think we'll have to do them every day? Maybe even after every meal, but that's okay. She can cook. Georgie agreed reluctantly. That's true, but dishes aren't any fun. If they're not fun for us, then they're not fun for Mama either. Don't you want her to be happy here? We need to do some of the things that aren't fun to make her happy. Emily bit her lip to keep from laughing. She honestly didn't mind doing the dishes, but the girls were certainly old enough to learn how and to start doing them on their own. Part of her job with her new family was to teach the girls to be good wives when they married. That meant teaching them to sew, cook, clean and do the dishes. She finished up Georgie's last sock as the girls finished the dishes. Then she went to check on the bread. It was perfectly browned, so she pulled it out and dumped it on a cloth on the table. The girls looked at their own small pieces of bread. Abby's was again pretty and smelled delicious. Georgie's looked like she'd rolled it in mud. "Can we eat them now, Mama?" Abby asked. "They'll be better warm." Georgie frowned down at hers. "I don't think mine's going to be good warm or cold." "Yes, you can eat them warm." Emily handed Georgie a dinner roll she'd put butter and a little cinnamon and sugar on. "Now you can eat something that tastes good too. Next time, don't put pepper on it." Georgie smiled and bit into her roll. "Thank you, Mama." Emily checked the chicken boiling in a pot on the stove and decided to give it a little more time. She wanted the chicken to fall off the bone before she added the dumplings and made a gravy for it. "After you're finished, would one of you girls show me how to get to the cellar?" "We both will," Abby told her. "There's a little food down there, but not much. Mama usually kept a kitchen garden and canned in the fall, but she died and the garden was overrun with weeds." She made a face. "I kept telling Papa I'd grow the plants, but he didn't want me to." Emily stroked her hand over Abby's head. "We'll plant a garden together in the spring, and you girls can help me weed it, and then we'll can them all next fall." Abby's eyes met Emily's. "I start school in September." She looked down at her food, obviously nervous at the idea. Emily smiled. "Before you start school, we'll make you 2 pretty dresses and I'll make sure you know how to read and write. It'll be easier for you that way." She certainly understood Abby's reticence. Abby let out a sigh of relief. "It's not going to be easy anyway. I don't want to go to school." "I didn't want to go either," Emily admitted, "but I made some really good friends there, and I'm so glad I did. It was hard, because like you, I'm really shy about talking to strangers." "Will you have any cousins in school?" Abby nodded. "Lots and lots. That'll make it easier. We have almost a year before you start, though, and we'll have everything ready before then." She squeezed Abby's hand to let her know they'd work together to get everything ready. Asterisk. Benjamin closed the shop a few minutes early and headed across the street to the cemetery. He'd told Anna that Emily was coming, but he wanted her to know how good Emily was with their girls. He knelt on the edge of her grave and started pulling the weeds as usual. "I got married yesterday. She's nothing like you. I guess in my head, I was sending off for a wife exactly like my first one." He set the weeds he'd picked off to the side. "The girls love her. She's very kind and gentle, and so far she seems to be a good cook. She's a tiny little thing, though. I feel like I'm going to break her if I touch her, and then I feel like I'm betraying you." He sighed heavily. "I still miss you every day. I'm not sure how I feel about her, but I know she's making our lives easier. I'm sorry I had to marry her, but our girls, they needed a new mama." Abby is finally smiling again. "The first time she smiled after your death is when I agreed to send off for a bride. Now that Emily's here, she's smiling all the time. Emily's more like Abby than you and Georgie. She's quiet. I have to work to talk to her, which I never had to do with you. I know it's strange, but I can't help but compare the two of you. I miss you, Anna." He stood up, still looking down at the gravestone. "I'll be late for supper if I don't go. I'll come see you again soon." He turned and walked back toward the house. He hoped Emily had fried up the chicken, but whatever she'd done, he was certain it would be tasty. She didn't cook Norwegian, but so far, he'd liked everything she'd made. He went into the house and washed his hands, inhaling the scent of the food she'd cooked. "That smells wonderful." Emily smiled at him. "It's all ready. We were just waiting on you." She was nervous about serving her new family their first real dinner with her. Sure, she'd made him breakfast, but any idiot could make eggs and bacon. Beans were easy as well. Hopefully they'd enjoy the chicken and dumplings. He looked around. She had made bread and it looked like there was a cake on the work table. His stomach growled as he took his seat at the table. She served him a bowl of pieces of chicken and something else. There were sliced up carrots as well. He wasn't sure what it was. He looked at it for a moment and then bowed his head to pray for his family. "So what's this?" he asked, poking at it with his spoon. "Chicken and dumplings. I can't believe you've never had it." Emily looked nervous that no one had ever eaten the food she'd fixed. It was a common meal in the East. "So those white things are dumplings?" he asked. The girls said they'd had dumplings before. "What do you think dumplings look like?" Emily bit her lip. No one had eaten a single bite of food yet. "Well, usually they're darker." He noticed then the girls weren't eating and were waiting for him. He took a bite and was surprised at how good it was. "This is delicious." After another quick bite, he took a sip of his water. "You can make this every night." The girls each took bites and smiled. They obviously liked it, too. Emily breathed a sigh of relief and started eating her own food. "I can learn to make dumplings the way you're used to eating them if you'd like." Benjamin shook his head. "Maybe, but I'll be happy to eat these anytime you want to fix them for us." He reached out for a dinner roll and buttered it. After taking a bite, he set it down. "Your bread is different from what we're used to as well, but it's very good. I guess food that's not Norwegian is good too." Benjamin polished off 3 bowls and each of the girls had 2. Emily had been planning to serve leftovers for lunch the following day, but she could see there wouldn't be enough. She couldn't complain, though, because they'd obviously enjoyed the meal. Benjamin leaned back and patted his full stomach. "If you cook like that every day, I won't be able to fit through the door soon." Emily smiled. "There's cake, too." His eyes flitted to the work table where he'd noticed the cake earlier. "I'll hate myself later, but I'll take a piece of cake." "Girls?" She looked to Abby and Georgie to see if they were interested in a piece of the cake they'd helped her make. Both girls nodded to indicate they wanted cake as well. She was surprised at how little the family talked while they ate. They seemed to take their food a lot more seriously than she was used to. She cut them each a slice of cake and returned to the table. She'd made a buttercream frosting for it she'd learned to make for the family she'd worked for. As before, both girls waited for Benjamin to try it, and at his smile, they ate theirs as well. Emily took small bites of her cake while watching the others. Obviously she'd done well with the meal. Finally, Benjamin pushed back from the table. "I know you said you'd worked as a cook, but when you said you didn't even know what Norwegian foods were, I doubted we'd be happy." "I was wrong. This meal was simply wonderful." Emily blushed, pleased with the praise. "Thank you." She turned to the girls. "Let's clear the table together, and then you girls can wash the dishes for me." She stood and began moving the dirty dishes from the table to the work table so they could be washed. Benjamin watched as the girls helped her clear off the table, and then went into the kitchen to wash the dishes with no argument. He stared at Emily in disbelief when she joined him in the parlor a few minutes later. "How did you do that?" Emily was confused. "How did I do what?" She hadn't done anything miraculous that she could see. Get them to do dishes so easily. I've been trying to get them to help with dishes ever since Anna died, but Georgie would start to whine, and Abby would say she needed to calm Georgie down, so I would do the dishes myself. Every day. Emily smiled. I simply told them it was time they started doing the dishes and showed them how. They did the lunch dishes earlier. She dropped her voice. I overheard Georgie complaining about having to help, but Abby said they needed to do them to keep me happy, because she was sure I hated doing them, too. Her eyes were sparkling with laughter when she told him. He laughed.
Yeah.
Right now, they'll do anything to keep you happy, because they don't want to go back to eating bacon sandwiches. I want to thank you again for the fabric. I'll start making a dress tomorrow. I didn't have time today with all the baking, and I wanted to get the girls' clothes mended and see what they needed. She leaned against the back of the sofa, watching him out of the corner of her eye. Do you need to do a lot of sewing for them? She shook her head. There was a bit of mending, but I got it all taken care of today. With the baking done and leftover beans for lunch, there's not even a lot of cooking to do tomorrow. I'll cut the dress out in the morning and teach the girls how to help me with it. I may be taking out their stitches and resewing after they go to bed, but at least they'll learn. She leaned back against the sofa and brought one of her legs under her, making sure her skirt was tucked around her modestly. I also want to get started teaching Abby how to read and write immediately. Why? They'll teach her that when she starts school. She's really nervous about starting school. She wants to learn early because it will give her confidence. She hadn't known her letters at all when she'd started school, and most of the other kids had. She'd felt like she was way behind, and knew it would give Abby confidence to know more than she had. Benjamin frowned. I didn't know she was nervous about starting school. Abby and I are a lot alike. I remembered being scared to start school, so I talked to her about it. Emily shrugged. She seemed to know what Abby was thinking and feeling most of the time, and she liked it that way. It made her job as a mother much easier. Of course, everyone knew what Georgie was thinking, because if she thought it, the words were soon coming out of her mouth. Well, of course, I want you to do what you can to make her feel better about it. He looked at her dress, hating how old and faded it looked, but not wanting to tell her that. He really wanted her to have her new dress done before he had her help him in the store or even took her to church. As a businessman, he knew he needed to keep up appearances. How long do you think it will take you to make your new dress? She made a face. I know this one is awful, but I didn't have the money or the time to make a new one before I came out here. She thought for a moment. If I spend a good amount of time on it every day, I can probably have it done by Saturday, I think. He nodded. Do that. She blushed. Do you want me to stop coming into the store until I have it ready? I can send the girls and buy themselves with your meals if I need to. She didn't want to embarrass him, and she knew her clothes were appalling. He could have kicked himself for bringing it up. Of course not. Just finish it soon. Okay, I will. The girls came into the room then, having finished the dishes, and the discussion was dropped. She'd hurry with it, though, because she didn't want to be an embarrassment to him. Chapter 7. Emily worked as hard as she could on the dress for the remainder of the week. While she sewed, she had both Abby and Georgie work on learning how to write their letters. By the time Saturday evening rolled around, they could both read a few simple words, and her dress was finished. She decided to surprise Benjamin with it by wearing it when he got home from work. She was surprised with how quickly she'd taken to being married. She had known she'd enjoy being a mother to the girls, but she had been surprised by how much she'd enjoyed her time in bed with Benjamin. Just thinking about the time they spent together after the girls went to bed, she blushed. Benjamin could make her entire body sing with pleasure without even trying. With as often as they made love, she knew she'd be pregnant before long. She sometimes caught herself daydreaming about having a little boy or girl. She'd love to be able to give Benjamin a boy. She knew he loved his girls, but surely he'd be thrilled to have a son. Didn't every man want a son to carry on the family name? She'd made pot roast for supper, and the girls set the table for her. They were getting to where she didn't even have to ask them to do the chores she'd designated for them. Even Georgie's room had looked tidy that morning after she was finished picking it up. Everything was on the table and ready. She glanced at the clock and saw it was 6:05. He'd be home any minute. She'd fixed her hair in a new way. She smoothed her dress down and straightened her apron. She was fidgeting and she knew it. She filled each of their glasses with milk and took the pie out of the oven to cool while they ate. It was blueberry, which the girls insisted was Benjamin's favorite. As soon as she set the pie on the work table, Benjamin came into the room. He took a deep sniff and smiled appreciatively. Every day I come home to new smells. You're spoiling me. He dropped a kiss on Emily's cheek before straightening up to study her. Your new dress looks beautiful on you. No one is going to notice me at church tomorrow when I have such a pretty lady on my arm. Emily blushed. You don't have to call me pretty, she whispered. I know I'm not. She knew pretty to him was blonde hair. Short of wearing a wig, she would never have blonde hair, so she'd never be pretty to him. She hated it, but she knew it was true. His eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't respond because the girls were listening. They'd talk about it later. He couldn't let his wife go another day without realizing how pretty she was. After the girls were in bed, she went straight to their bedroom, as had become her habit, to change into her nightgown and braid her hair for sleep. Benjamin had gone outside for a brief walk, as he did every night, while she readied herself. She knew he didn't really want to walk so late at night, but was thankful for the time he gave her to prepare herself for bed. She stripped off her new dress and hung it lovingly in the armoire. She would happily wear it to church the following morning. She'd never owned anything quite so fine, and was very proud of it. She put her nightgown on and slipped between the sheets, knowing Benjamin would be back soon. She was always careful to cover herself up before he came in. He'd only seen her naked body once, and that was the morning after their wedding. Within a minute of her getting into bed, he opened the door and quickly stripped off his clothes. She turned her head before she could see him unclothed, and he got into bed with her without turning down the lantern. You forgot the lantern, she reminded him. He shook his head, looming over her in the dark. Tonight I want to watch you while I make love to you. She clutched the covers to her chest. Why? She couldn't let him do that, could she? The other time he'd seen her, it was because it was daylight. Surely it wouldn't be proper to leave the lamp lit just because he wanted to see her. He brushed his lips across hers. Because you're beautiful, and I like to look at you. She shook her head. No, I'm not. I saw the picture you have of Anna in your drawer. She was pretty. I'm not. Why did he keep telling her she was pretty, when he knew she wasn't as well as she did? He was ashamed of her in her old clothes, and she could tell. If she were pretty, he'd be proud of her whether she was wearing something new or not. His hand stroked down her body, and he was thwarted, as usual, by her nightgown. She was pretty in a different way than you are. She was loud, where you're quiet. Tall where you're petite. The two of you are as different as night and day, but that doesn't mean you're not pretty, too. No one has ever said I'm pretty before. She stared up at him and realized that wasn't true. Well, my mother did, but she doesn't count. He smiled as he pressed kisses along her collarbone. Of course her opinion counts. The girls think you're pretty. I think you're one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. She turned her head to the side to give him access to her body. His fingers went to the buttons on her nightgown, pushing it open. His lips quickly followed the V he created as his hands went lower, catching the skirt of her nightgown and pulling it up. I wish you'd quit wearing these silly things. Why bother when you know I'm just going to take them off? His lips were making her tingle inside. You'd save yourself some laundry if you just skipped them altogether. He coaxed her into a sitting position and pulled her nightgown over her head, his eyes going to her breasts, which were now bare for him. His lips brushed against her nipple, taking one into his mouth to suck on it. She moaned softly, caught up in what he was doing, but still self-conscious about the light. "Please turn the light off," she whispered. She was almost panicked at the idea of him watching her while they made love. How could he think it was okay to do that? "But then I couldn't see how beautiful you are when I do this," he whispered as he slipped his hand between her thighs, finding her opening. "I want to see your face when you find your pleasure." She blushed, but couldn't stop herself from responding to him. He rolled to his back and pulled her on top of him, straddling his hips. Her eyes met his filled with shock. What was he doing? They couldn't make love this way. Could they? She looked down and saw his erection for the first time. She was shocked to see how big it really was. How had that fit into her? It was a good thing she hadn't seen it before they'd made love for the first time, or she'd have been even more afraid than she already was. She reached down and took it into her hand, something she'd never done. It felt strange to her. He let out a groan and she let go as if her hand was on fire. "Did I hurt you?" she asked. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "It felt good. But is it okay for me to touch you there? It's not wrong?" Her eyes met his as she searched for her answer. Surely she shouldn't touch him there. "Nothing is wrong between us. We're married." He caught her hand and brought it back to his member, showing her how to stroke him to make him feel good. She watched his face as she continued the motions after he removed his hand. She was surprised to see she could bring him so much pleasure. She moved her hand slowly, and then faster, watching his face to see what he liked best. After a moment he caught her hand. "Did I do something wrong?" "Not at all. I just don't want to finish without bringing you pleasure." "Finish?" She stared at him blankly for a moment, and then understanding dawned and she blushed. "You mean you could do that from my hand on you?" He nodded, amused at her innocence. Even after almost a week of marriage where he'd done his best to tutor her in the ways of love, she was still incredibly naive. "I want to be inside you when it happens." She blushed, and started to roll off him onto her back. He caught her hips. "Where do you think you're going? You said you want to be inside me." "I want that, too." As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she clamped her hand over it. How could she have said something like that to him? His hands lifted her hips and positioned her over him. "I want to see how you like it this way," he whispered. He pressed up as he put pressure on her hips to get her to move down. Gravity did most of the work for him, and within a moment, she realized what he was doing as he pressed deep inside her. For a moment she sat stunned, unsure of what to do. She bit her lip, simply enjoying the feel of having him inside her. He flexed his hips upward, and she moaned. "That feels good." He smiled. "Good. Move around. Do what feels good to you." She stared at him in surprise. He wasn't going to control their movements? After a second, she leaned forward, putting a hand on either side of his shoulders to catch her weight. She moved her hips up for a moment and then right back down. He groaned and she was shocked by how much pleasure riding him this way brought her. It didn't take her long to find her rhythm, and a few minutes later, they both found their release. She felt the sweat trickling off her body as she rolled to her side beside him. He reached out to turn the wick down, and she snuggled into his arms with her head on his shoulders. She was too embarrassed to say anything, but she fell asleep with a smile on her face. Marriage was definitely to her liking. Asterisk. She was careful to avoid his mother during church on Sunday. Georgie ran to her far more, hugging her tightly, but Abby clung to her hand throughout the time before and after the service. She spoke with Brigitta and a few others she'd met during the week during her forays into the store, but mostly she stayed to herself, which suited her and Abby just fine. She enjoyed watching groups of people, she just didn't enjoy being parts of those groups. Abby watched the other children playing, and Emily tried to encourage her to join them, but she would only shake her head. "I want to stay with you, Mama." After church, they walked the short distance to their home to get the picnic basket she'd packed before anyone else was awake. While Benjamin hitched up the team, she went to get the basket and a quilt for them to sit on. The temperature was chilly, but it wasn't so cold they would be uncomfortable during their time outdoors. She hurried outside to find the girls already in the buggy waiting for her. Benjamin took the basket before helping her into her seat, and then handed the basket to her. Once they were on their way, she turned to the girls. "Are you excited?" She thought, no matter how excited they were, there was no way their excitement could match hers. She'd always fantasized about having a life where she could go on picnics when she wanted to, and now she suddenly had one. Georgie bounced in the seat clapping her hands, while Abby sat like a little lady, but her face glowed with pleasure. "I made some things that I had on picnics back east. I wasn't sure if you'd like them, but I hope you will." Instead of going with just the things they talked about before, she'd added several things she thought her new family might enjoy. Benjamin glanced at her. "Anything you want to cook, I'm happy to eat. I've never met a better cook, and I'm including more in that. Please don't tell her I said that, though." He winked at her as he drove carefully along the country roads toward the pond Georgie had indicated she enjoyed. Emily felt as if she'd just been handed the best compliment of her life. With the way his mother spoke to her about not being able to cook Norwegian foods, she was thrilled he liked her cooking so well. "I won't say a word." And she wouldn't, but she was thrilled to receive the compliment. She and the girls spread the quilt out before she dug in the picnic basket. She let the girls set the table with the plates and forks she'd brought. She brought out the small flask of lemonade she'd prepared and gave the girls glasses. Benjamin sat watching the whole ritual with a smile on his face. It was as if they'd rehearsed exactly how they wanted to do this. While the girls were seeing to the lemonade, she started pulling out their feast. First came the bread and cheese. She also pulled out potato salad and deviled eggs along with baked beans. So many typical American foods were new to them because of the tight-knit Norwegian community they'd always been part of. She felt like she was constantly introducing them to foods everyone she'd ever known had eaten. She left the cookies in the basket, knowing the girls would want to have them right away if they knew she'd brought them. They all sat down on the quilt, and Benjamin said their prayer for them. She took each plate and filled it with some of everything. Benjamin spent a minute poking at his food before opening his mouth and taking the first bite of baked beans. His eyes widened with surprise. "These are beans, but what kind? What do you call them?" "Baked beans." She loved introducing Benjamin in particular to new foods. He always looked at them like they were some sort of foreign insect, but then he'd open his mouth and take a big bite, and his smile would tell her what he thought of it. "Delicious." He tried a bite of her potato salad and smiled. "We have something similar. This is your potato salad, right?" She nodded. "Do you like it?" "I love it." He looked at the deviled egg. "An egg, but you've added something to the yolk." He sampled everything quickly and pronounced it all delicious. The girls quickly followed suit, enjoying everything she'd made. When they'd all stuffed themselves, she pulled out the cookies. They were simple sugar cookies, but she'd frosted them to make them special. Georgie and Abby each ate a few, but Benjamin said he'd have to wait as he patted his stomach. Abby looked at Emily with admiration in her eyes. "Mama, I want to learn to cook like you do. I'm sure I can have my pick of all the men in Minnesota if I can cook half as well as you can." Emily laughed self-consciously, but promised she would be happy to teach her everything she knew. She sat back and pulled one last thing from the picnic basket. "I don't know if you've ever heard of this book, but I received this copy as a gift for Christmas when I was 10. It's become my favorite book, and I've read it over and over again." She handed the book to Abby. "Do you think you can read the title?" While both girls could read a few basic words, Abby had learned to read some more difficult ones, and Emily hoped she could decipher the simple title. Abby stared at the cover for a moment, glancing at her father, and obviously a little intimidated that he was watching her. Little. Woe, men. Little woman? Emily smiled. That's very good. It's Little Women. Have you heard of it? Both girls shook their heads, so she looked at Benjamin. Never heard of it. Well, it's about 4 young ladies who are trying to get by the best they can during the Civil War. She looked down at the book in her hands, which she had treasured for 10 years. If you don't mind, I thought I could read a chapter or 2 while we sat here. She looked from face to face, hoping they'd like the idea. She wasn't sure what they were used to doing on picnics, but she knew the girls enjoyed being read to, so maybe they'd like the book. Abby smiled. I'd like that more than anything. Yes, please. Georgie agreed. Benjamin smiled and watched as his wife opened the book and began reading to his mesmerized daughters. Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents, grumbled Jo, lying on the rug. Her voice was soft, but fluid as she read through the first 2 chapters. Both girls listened intently, smiling and frowning at all the right places. Finally, when 2 chapters were finished, Emily closed the book. We'll read some more another time. She opened the picnic basket to return the book. Oh, please, just one more chapter, Mama. Abby begged. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my voice if I keep going. She looked to Benjamin. Would you care to read a chapter? She'd never heard him read aloud and wondered how he would do. His deep voice seemed particularly suited for reading. He held his hand out for the book. He'd found the story of Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy as fascinating as his daughters did. He opened to the 3rd chapter and began to read. While he read the familiar words, Emily studied him. He was a different man than she'd met that first day. He was more relaxed now, and much easier to be around. Even his relationship with the girls seemed to have changed in some way she just couldn't put her finger on. This was her first chance to just sit and look at her new husband without worry he'd catch her. He was a handsome man, taller than any man she'd known back east. His hair was blonde, and his eyes were the same deep blue of his daughters. They reminded her of paintings she'd seen of the ocean. His nose was straight, and a little large for his face, but to her, the imperfection only added to his good looks. She knew if she'd met him any way other than the way she had, she would have automatically dismissed him as too handsome for her. Benjamin finished reading the chapter and calmly handed the book back to Emily. She put the paper she'd brought with her to mark the page into the book and put it back into the picnic basket. Is there anything else you want to eat? If not, I'm putting everything up, she warned. Benjamin reached out and took one of the cookies he'd skipped earlier and ate it in 2 bites. The girls both shook their heads, still full from all they'd eaten earlier. Emily packed up the picnic basket to be taken home. There was enough food left they could have it for a cold supper, which would be nice, because she was tired. They'd done very little except go to church and picnic that day, but she'd gotten up 2 hours early to fix them a feast for their picnic lunch. How would her new family react if she napped this afternoon? She wondered. Once they were home, she realized it was already 4:30. They usually ate around 6, so there wasn't a great deal of time before supper. She sent the girls to the kitchen with the dishes from the picnic and sat down on the sofa with Benjamin in the parlor. You look exhausted, he told her. She nodded. I am. I got up 2 hours early to fix the extra foods for the picnic. I could have made them yesterday, but I wanted to finish my dress. I also wanted the foods to be a surprise for the girls. She felt like she needed to explain her tiredness away, because she didn't want him to think she was simply lazy. They were a wonderful surprise. You said in your letters you could cook, but I think we expected you to be able to cook like most wives can cook. You could open a restaurant. She brushed the compliment aside. It comes from practice. I cooked for a living, so I was cooking every day of my life. I was bound to become good at it. She tried to be modest about the compliment, but inside she was bouncing for joy that he enjoyed her cooking so much. He patted his lap. Stretch out and put your head on my lap. Sleep for a few minutes before supper. She nodded. You don't mind eating picnic food for supper again, do you? She asked as she curled up on the sofa with her head on his thigh. His hand rubbed up and down her arm as she closed her eyes and relaxed. I was going to insist if you didn't suggest it. He dropped a kiss onto her cheek. Sleep. She yawned. I never nap. She was too tired to protest any harder though. She closed her eyes and happily sank into oblivion. You do today. Asterisk. It was dark out when Emily woke up. She jerked awake, startled to find herself on such a small space. Benjamin's hand automatically rubbed her back soothingly. I was about to have to wake you. We're all getting hungry. She sat up and stretched. Thank you for letting me sleep. She blinked, trying to force herself to wake faster. It was my pleasure. He traced her cheek with one finger. The girls are upstairs playing quietly. I had them set the table, but we waited for you to eat. There was no need. Everything can be eaten cold. She felt badly they'd waited when they could have simply eaten without her. She hated that he'd made the girls go hungry. He shook his head. We didn't wait because we needed you to cook for us. We waited because we wanted the pleasure of your company with our supper. He stood up and called the girls. I'll help you set the food out. No, you don't need to do that. It was her job to get the food on the table. He made a living for them, so she needed to do her share as well. I don't mind. You've made my life so much better by being here. He opened the picnic basket and helped her set the different foods on the table. The girls came running in. You slept for a long time, Mama. We're starving. Georgie took her seat and waited while Benjamin and Emily finished putting the food out. Abby sat down and folded her hands in her lap. Did you have a good nap, Mama? I did. Thank you both for being so quiet. Emily took her seat and waited while Benjamin took his. He prayed softly before they each took a generous helping of everything left. What time is it anyway? Benjamin grinned. 7:30. But we eat at 6. You should have gotten me up. She wondered why they weren't angry with her. There was no reason she should have slept so long. None of us will die from eating an hour and a half later than usual. I thought I was going to, Georgie complained. Abby kicked Georgie under the table. We understood you were tired. We were happy to wait. Emily looked at Georgie. I'm very sorry I made you wait. I won't make a habit of it. Georgie sighed. I guess it was okay, but just this once. After supper, the girls did the dishes without being told. Emily gathered the dirty laundry from the house and put it together to be washed and hung on the line in the morning. Once she was finished, she returned to Benjamin, who was reading the small local paper in the parlor. I'm going to spend tomorrow doing laundry and baking, but if you want, I'll come into the store on Tuesday and you can show me around, so I'll be ready to take your place if need be. She loved the idea of helping him with his work on occasion. He studied her for a moment and nodded. I'd like that. I also want you to pick out some fabric to make yourself 2 more new dresses. Her eyes widened. Oh, but I already have this new dress. I can wear this whenever I work in the store or go to church, and my old ones for around the house. She hated the idea of wasting money and time on more dresses for herself when there were so many things the girls needed. He sighed, taking her hands in his. No, you really can't. I don't want to insult you, but your old dresses are much too shabby to wear around town. As the wife of the owner of the only store in town, you're expected to dress better than most women, and you don't dress nearly as well as most of the others. Please don't take this wrong, but you need a whole new wardrobe as quickly as possible. She looked down at her hands embarrassed. Well, one more dress would be enough then. I'll have one for dressing up and one for every day. How could she not have realized just how strongly he felt about her wardrobe? She could make another dress quickly. 2 more is the least amount. I'd prefer you made another 6 dresses, so you'd have one for every day of the week. Don't worry about the money. I'm not a wealthy man, but I can certainly afford some new dresses for my wife. She sighed. I want to make the girls some new clothes, too, though. I don't want to spend all my time on my own clothes. She would feel guilty spending that much time on herself when she had 2 little girls who needed dresses as well. What she had covered her sufficiently, but the girls' dresses were getting much too short. Well, how about this? Make 2 more dresses for yourself, and then 2 dresses for each of the girls, and then 2 new dresses for yourself again. I know it's a lot of sewing, but you really need the new clothes. He thought for a moment. Or we could have more make dresses for the girls. She wouldn't mind. Emily was offended at the very idea. I'll stay awake sewing all night every night before I'll allow your mother to make more clothes for the girls. It's my responsibility, and I'll do it. She was certainly going to take care of the girls' clothes herself no matter what. Benjamin was surprised. Anna would have jumped at the chance to ask for help. Why? Your mother already thinks I'm not good enough to raise your girls. I'm not going to give her more reason to hate me. Emily knew her voice sounded angry, but she didn't know how to change that. His mother was hateful to her, and she was simply not going to give her reason to act the way she already did. Moore doesn't hate you. He knew she was annoyed that he had married someone from out east instead of Kirsten, but she didn't hate Emily. Moore didn't hate anyone. She's just not used to the idea she doesn't get to do everything for the girls anymore. She liked having them under her control. Emily knew it wasn't the truth, but she wasn't going to argue with him. That must be it. She wasn't going to discuss it any longer, so she quickly changed subjects. I'll come by the store in the morning and pick out more fabric. I can have another dress made by the end of the week if I start right away. And she would. If it killed her, she'd have both dresses done by Sunday, and then she could start on new dresses for the girls on Monday of the following week. After making love that night, she lay in her husband's arms thinking about their day. Other than their slight argument about her dresses and his mother's help, it had been a good day. She dreaded going to a new church for the first time, but she'd been pleasantly surprised by how well that had gone. It was nice to have Abby at her side while Benjamin was off talking to friends and relatives. I want to thank you for how accepting and loving of my daughters you've been, he told her as he played with her hair. You've made it very clear to them that you love them and consider them your own. I can't think of another woman who would have been more perfect for the job of being mother to them. She blushed in the dark. She was thankful for his words of praise, but wished he would tell her she'd been a good pick for wife for him as well as mother to the girls. I enjoy the girls a great deal. I love them both as if I'd given birth to them. She had been surprised at just how much she loved the girls. She knew she enjoyed children, of course, but she didn't expect to love the 2 of them as much as she did. He kissed the top of her head. It shows in the way you treat them. Abby especially has been a completely different child since you've been here. Abby is a joy for me. I understand how she thinks because we're so much alike. Georgie is a delight as well, but I don't feel the same affinity for her. Not that I don't love her as much, I just don't quite understand her. It wasn't as important for her to understand Georgie, though, and they both knew it. Understanding Abby was the important thing, because Abby was quieter and not as given to sharing her feelings. Georgie was happy to tell a total stranger what she thought and felt about any subject under the sun. He laughed. I don't think anyone truly understands Georgie. She's a boisterous child. I think you sending off for a wife when you'd so recently lost one must have been a difficult thing to do. It shows just how much your girls mean to you. You can't be with them all the time, because you need to support them, so it made sense you provided them with someone who could be with them all the time. She brushed her lips across his bare shoulder. I'm just thankful I was the one who got to complete your family. I think I'm going to be very happy here. She already was happy. If she had his love, though, her happiness would be complete. She couldn't tell him that, though. As the thought occurred to her, she realized the truth. She'd fallen in love with her husband. How could she have gone and done such a thing? He was still in love with his dead wife. He only praised her about being a good mother, not about being a good wife to him. Why did the knowledge of being in love with her husband make her suddenly feel so lonely? Why couldn't she simply accept what he had to give her? He shared his life with her. Shouldn't that be enough? She hadn't come here wanting or expecting love from him. It had been an arrangement to help him with his girls, and so she would have a home to go to at the end of the day. He'd done everything he'd said he would do for her, and she should be happy with that. Why wasn't she? She rolled away from him and faced the wall, curling into a ball. Being in love should fill her with joy, shouldn't it? So why did she feel like she would never feel warm again? Chapter 8. Emily and the girls went to the store with Benjamin on Monday morning to pick out the fabric for Emily's 2 new dresses. Emily decided she'd cut them both together, so she could save some time. She looked through the different bolts of fabric trying to check the prices without Benjamin seeing her. He'd told her to pay no attention to the price, but she just couldn't force herself to ignore the prices. She'd had to live frugally for too many years to give up the habit now. The least expensive cloth was a dark brown. She didn't particularly care for it, but she could make a good serviceable dress from it. She held it up and studied it for a moment. From across the room, Benjamin saw Emily hold up the ugliest fabric he'd ever seen. It was the least expensive fabric he had, so he knew what she was doing. Why couldn't she listen to him when he told her she could have any of the fabrics in the store without a problem? He strode across the room and removed the fabric from her hands. I'll pick your fabrics. But absolutely not. You will not nickel and dime your wardrobe and wear ugly dresses. He ran his finger along the tops of the different fabrics, trying to find the pastel colors he knew would be best on her. Finally his fingers found the pink he'd been looking for. He held it up in front of her, judging the color. This one. He handed it to her to hold while he found the other color. He stopped on a mint green, again holding it up to her face. And this one. He put the brown back in its former place. Those will look the prettiest on you. I'll watch when I get the next shipment in for more pretty colors. You can't always give me the best of the shipments, Benjamin. You'll lose business. She couldn't stand it if he were to lose money because of her. It's my business to lose. No more ugly dresses for my wife. He walked to the counter and picked out a cameo brooch he'd had his eye on for her, and plucked it from its display. You'll take this as well, and you'll like it. His eyes dared her to argue with him. She took the things he handed to her. Thank you. Why did she feel so annoyed with him for giving her pretty things? I'll go get started right away. She was halfway up the stairs with the girls when she realized why she was angry with him. It was because he was ashamed of her. Her steps slowed as she blinked back tears. Straightening her shoulders, she hurried up and sat down at the table. She'd gotten up early to do her baking and laundry, so now the only thing left was to do her daily cooking. Lunch was on the stove, so it was just a matter of getting the sewing done. Are you girls ready to see just how fast we can make 2 dresses? Abby smiled and nodded. I think we can have them done by Thursday, Mama. I hope so, because I want you each to have a new dress by Sunday as well. No matter what it took, she was going to have the dresses Benjamin insisted she needed and the dresses the girls needed done by Sunday. She didn't care if she got no sleep before then. Asterisk. With careful cutting, she was able to get a dress for herself and a dress for each of the girls out of each of the bolts of cloth. She even had enough left over to make them matching bonnets. When Sunday morning dawned, all three of them were in new dresses. She'd stayed up late into the night to finish the dresses for the girls, despite Benjamin's protests. If he was embarrassed of how she dressed, how could he not be embarrassed of the girls' two short Sunday dresses? She wouldn't embarrass him again. She put her brooch on to finish off her pink dress and walked down to walk with her family to church. They'd been invited out to Benjamin's parents' house for lunch after church, and she was not looking forward to going. She knew it would be a little easier with the work she'd done all week proudly displayed on herself and the girls, but she was sure her mother-in-law would find something to complain about. After church, she followed Benjamin out to the buggy and climbed in beside him. She'd made some dinner rolls and a side dish to take with them, hoping her mother-in-law would appreciate the gesture. When they pulled up into the yard, she realized they were the only ones there. Why had she assumed it was going to be the entire extended family? She didn't want to be alone with her mother-in-law for any period of time. The woman spewed venom at her anytime Benjamin wasn't there. Benjamin helped her down and she carried the dinner rolls and Benjamin carried the pot with her corn chowder into the house. Even though they weren't Norwegian foods, she hoped that the fact she'd made an effort to help out with the meal would be appreciated. Georgie ran in and hugged her far more, while Abby hung back clinging to Emily's hand. Emily set the dinner rolls she'd made on the work table and Benjamin put the corn chowder down as well. The corn chowder had been kept warm in the oven while they'd been in church, and they'd picked it up on their way to the farm. Ingrid thanked Emily for the food and smiled at her. Emily wasn't sure what brought about the change of heart, but she was thrilled to see it. She helped set the table and put the food on while everyone settled into their seats. Benjamin's father said the blessing, and as soon as they were done, and the food was served, Emily couldn't help but notice that everyone ate some of the food she prepared except Ingrid. Sven complimented her on the corn chowder. "This is a soup? It's very good. It's corn chowder. It's a very popular dish in Massachusetts." Emily ate a bit of everything. She watched as the girls ate some of everything, but had seconds of the corn chowder. She couldn't help but smile over the way they devoured the new foods she fixed them. After they were finished eating, the men went out to the barn, while she stayed inside with Ingrid and the girls. She helped clear the table, and watched as the girls automatically helped as well. She was pleased the girls were doing what she expected of them at home even when they were at their grandmother's house. When it was time to start the dishes, Ingrid shooed the girls outside to play. Abby bit her lip and looked at Emily uncertainly, but Emily nodded. "Run along. We'll do the dishes." As soon as the door closed behind the girls, Ingrid turned on Emily. "You are ruining those girls. Why did they think they needed to help clear the table? At my house they're still little girls, and they don't help with cooking or cleaning. And the food you prepared? Why haven't you learned to cook anything Norwegian yet? My son prefers Norwegian food and you must be a huge disappointment to him. I don't know why he hasn't sent you right back east where you belong." Emily blinked a few times at the about face. She should have expected it, but she hadn't. "I'm not going to fight with you, Mrs. Johnson. I'm doing the best I can do with the girls, and I'm cooking what I know how to cook. They aren't starving under my clumsy attempts to feed them, so I must not be doing too badly." She bit her tongue against what she really wanted to say. She'd never used a swear word in her life, but she wanted to then. She mentally counted to 10, and then repeated it. "How dare you talk to me that way? In the Norwegian culture we respect our elders and treat them as if they are wiser." Emily slammed down the dish she was drying, turning to face her mother-in-law. Where she got the courage, she would never know, but she wasn't going to put up with being treated badly for another minute when she had been working her fingers to the bone for her new family. She simply hadn't had enough sleep to deal with her mother-in-law. "As you've pointed out repeatedly, I'm not Norwegian. I respect people who treat me as if I'm a human being. Since you can't see fit to treat me as if I'm better than an animal, I feel no need to treat you with respect." She threw down her dish towel and stormed outside, leaving her mother-in-law to do the dishes on her own. She found the girls sitting on the ground playing with marbles. She squatted down to join them, fighting against her anger. The girls didn't need to see her have an angry fit, whether she wanted to or not. She took deep calming breaths as the girls explained the rules for marbles, and she watched them play with a smile. Her own childhood had included few games of fun, and she enjoyed watching the girls play. Within minutes she'd calmed down again, although she was determined to speak with Benjamin when they got home about the way his mother treated her. She was thankful the woman hadn't chosen to attack her in front of her girls, but she still wasn't pleased she'd been attacked at all. Asterisk. Benjamin leaned against the horse's stall in the barn while his far smoked his pipe. "I'm really surprised at what a good little wife she is. The girls absolutely adore her, and she's helped Abby to come out of her shell. I never thought I'd see Abby smile again after Anna died, but Emily has brought about a miracle. She's laughing and smiling again, and reading. Emily has taught her to read beautifully in just 2 weeks. My house is like a different place." Benjamin couldn't say enough good things about his new wife. She'd been a true blessing to his family, and he was ready to put a halo on top of the tiny woman's head. Far nodded, listening. "And you're not afraid to touch her anymore?" Benjamin laughed. "I got over that. I honestly never thought I'd be able to have another woman in my life after Anna, but Emily has completed our family." He patted his stomach. "And her cooking? I've never tasted anything like it. At first, I was disappointed that she didn't know how to make any Norwegian dishes, but I find I don't miss them at all. Every day she makes something I've never had before, and I like it more than the last thing." He pulled out the waist of his slacks. "I had lost a lot of weight after Anna died, and I've put it all right back on since Emily got here. She's going to have to let the waist out on all my pants in another week if I keep eating the way I have been." He knew he was raving about her like a man in love, but he just couldn't seem to stop himself. The corn chowder was delicious. Everything she cooks is delicious. And she sews beautifully. He didn't add that she kept him happy in bed as well. He knew his far could see that written all over his face. "I noticed the 3 of them wearing matching pink dresses today." Benjamin smiled as he thought about their outfits for church. "I have to fight her to spend money on herself. She looks for the least expensive thing, trying to save every penny she can. I have to fight her to get her to take more expensive things." He sighed. "I wish she was willing to spend just a bit more on herself, but at least she's not trying to spend every dime I make on frivolous purchases. What kind of man complains that his wife doesn't spend enough?" Far just nodded. "She has so much patience with the girls. There are times when I'm getting frustrated with Georgie, and she'll just smile and talk to her softly, correcting her behavior without Georgie even realizing it. And the girls now do the dishes after every meal without even being asked. They wouldn't do them for me for anything, but they'll do anything for Emily." He leaned back against the wall of the barn, smiling and staring off into space as he spoke. "I'm glad you found a woman you could love." Love? Was he in love with Emily? Surely not. He stood staring at his father for a moment in stunned silence. He appreciated Emily, of course. And there was no doubt he felt desire for her. He proved that over and over again. But love? Wasn't love the overwhelming feeling he'd always felt for Anna? He remembered sitting in the schoolroom staring at Anna, and walking her home after school stealing a kiss. Was that just schoolboy love? Was he feeling an adult love for Emily? He'd never questioned how his love for Anna had changed during their years of marriage. She'd just been there for him. Had love for his new wife crept up on him without him even realizing it? "I don't know that I love her, Far." He couldn't love her. He'd promised Anna he wouldn't fall in love with his new wife. Far laughed. You don't, huh? You stand there moon-eyed talking about the woman nonstop and you don't think you love her? Of course, you do. You think the woman can do no wrong. You've done nothing but praise her since we came in here. Tell me, how would you feel if Emily left? Benjamin felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. How would he feel if Emily left? He'd hate it. How could he love her, though? He'd vowed to love Anna for the rest of his life. Or the rest of her life. Anna's life was over. Did that mean he had the right to move on and love another? Could he love another? He gave Far a blank look. Sven clapped his youngest son on the shoulder. You think about it. She's a lovely young woman, and I'm happy she's in your life. She's exactly what you needed now that Anna is gone. He sighed softly. I know you think you buried your heart with your wife, but you're too young to do that. You have a wife who is making you feel whole again. She's healing your heart and the hearts of your children. Let yourself love her. The two men left the barn and Benjamin frowned when he saw his wife crouching in the dirt with the girls. Why did she never stay in the house with his Moore? He knew she was shy, but Moore was family, and she deserved to be treated with more respect than that. He'd have to talk with her about it when they got home. Emily looked up when she saw Benjamin approaching with his father. Are you ready to go? She asked. He nodded. Are you? He looked around in confusion, wondering if his mother had come outside with them or if she'd stayed in. Why did Emily always leave her alone? Yes, but I forgot the bread basket and the pot with the chowder in the house. Would you mind getting it for me? He gave her a questioning look, but she shook her head, indicating the girls. She obviously had something she needed to say to him without the girls listening. Whatever it was could wait until he talked to her about her disrespect for his mother, though. He went into the house and said,
Goodbye.
Getting the pot and the bread basket. We'll see you at church on Sunday, Moore. He pressed a kiss to her cheek as he took the things he needed. She smiled at him brightly. I do miss seeing the girls. I don't feel like I can go visit them during the week since Emily hates me so much. Benjamin's eyes widened. Emily hates you? What do you mean? Hadn't Emily told him his Moore hated her? What was going on? She had tears in her eyes as she said, she actually told me she doesn't respect me. Her culture must be a great deal different than ours. I'll talk to her, Moore. She can't treat you that way. He shook his head. Emily was obviously very different around his mother than she was around him. You can come into town and see the girls anytime you want during the week. I won't let her stop you. He was angry at the mere idea of Emily trying to stop his mother from seeing the girls. What was she thinking? Yes, she was their new mother, but they had every right in the world to see their grandmother. His mother smiled and hugged him. Thank you, Benjamin. I'm so glad you respect me, even though your wife doesn't. He carried the things out to the buggy, handing them up to Emily, who must have been helped in by his father. He was so angry with her he couldn't speak as they drove home. How could she treat his mother so disrespectfully? Once they were home, he helped her down from the buggy without saying a word. While he unhitched the horses, she took the girls inside and sent them upstairs to play in their rooms. She had to talk to him about the way his mother was treating her. She heard the front door slam behind him and waited for him in the parlor. He walked in and looked around. Where are the girls? He didn't want them to hear what he had to say to her. I sent them up to their rooms to play. I need to talk to you. Her face showed her anger over something. He wondered what right she had to be angry when she was the one mistreating his mother. Good. I need to talk to you as well. He took a deep breath, still trying to control his temper. Moore told me you said you didn't respect her. He waited for her to deny it, so he could yell at her for lying. He was so angry all he wanted to do was yell at her. How could she be so different with him than she was around his mother? She felt her heart drop into her stomach. Excuse me? She was in tears. Why do you always leave her house when I'm talking with Far in the barn? Why don't you stay in the house and help her with dishes like all my sisters do? Like Anna did? He felt guilty for throwing Anna in her face, but she'd said she didn't respect his mother. What kind of woman said that to her mother-in-law? Emily closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. She couldn't believe she was being accused of wrongdoing when she had been the one mistreated. May I tell you what happened without interruption, please? He walked to her and sat next to her on the sofa. His movements were angry, and she knew he was furious with her. Be my guest. I'll listen. And he would try to listen. He wasn't sure he could, but he would try. After lunch, the girls helped clear the table like they do at home, and they were going to help with the dishes. Your mother sent them outside instead. She told me I'm ruining the girls by making them help with dishes, and that I need to cook Norwegian foods for them. She complains to me I'm not Norwegian every time I see her. She felt the tears sting her eyes as she recalled how his mother had treated her. She told me I'm a huge disappointment to you. I explained that I cook what I know how to cook and the girls aren't starving, so I must be doing okay. She told me that in the Norwegian culture people respect their elders. I told her I don't respect people who treat me worse than they treat animals, and that's exactly what your mother does. She's very cruel to me. Benjamin clenched his fist. How dare she try to blame his mother for her cruel words? She wouldn't have said that to you. She may have suggested you learn to cook a few Norwegian meals, but the rest of it? I don't believe it. Moore was always kind and loving to Anna. Why would she be any different to you? Because I'm not Norwegian and I disappoint her? How should I know? I only know how she treats me, and I don't like it. I can't believe you believe her over me. Have you ever known me to be unkind to anyone? She stared at him in disbelief. She was his wife, and she'd done everything he'd asked of her and more. She had never done a single thing to upset him, and he believed that old harridan over him? What was wrong with him? No, but I've never known Moore to be unkind either, and I've known her far longer than I've known you. Emily recoiled as if she'd been slapped. She'd really thought her marriage was a good one until today. I see. She stood up and went into the kitchen to start the evening meal. He followed her. You will promise me to be kind to my mother? Yes, of course, I will. She removed the iron skillet she needed to brown the potatoes she planned on frying from the wall, not looking at her husband. As far as she was concerned, until he started to believe her, their marriage wouldn't work. Benjamin stood staring at her back, wondering why she'd stopped talking to him. Finally, he threw his hands up in disgust, leaving the house and slamming the door behind him. As soon as she heard the door close, Emily sat down at the table and put her head in her hands and cried. How could she fight a dead wife and a mother-in-law who hated her? She'd lost her husband, and she knew it. Asterisk. It was almost dusk when Benjamin slammed out of the house, automatically walking toward the graveyard to talk to Anna. He knelt at her grave, brushing the leaves away. In the time since he'd been there, the leaves had gone from pretty oranges and reds to a dull brown. They littered the ground on top of her grave. I'm confused, Anna. I thought Emily was such a good woman. She's been a real blessing to the girls and to me, but Moore told me she said some horrible things to her. The person I thought she was would never have been so rude to my mother. He sighed heavily. What if I'm doing the wrong thing by leaving her alone with our girls all day, every day? And what's more, when I was talking to Far today, I realized that I love her. I still love you, of course. You'll always hold a huge place in my heart, but there's some room left for another good woman. I thought Emily was the woman I needed to complete my life and that of the girls. I don't know what I was thinking. How could I have lost my heart to a woman who would disrespect Moore? I'm so confused. I want what's best for the girls, of course, and Emily seems to be doing a good job with them. He grinned. You should see the way the girls jump up after every meal to clear the table and do the dishes. Georgie has to stand on a chair, but she does it, and she dries them beautifully. You'd be so proud of our girls. And the dresses she made them. I swear they look more like you every day. He traced his finger over her name. But how can the woman who has done such nice things for my girls, and who cooks meals better than anyone I've ever met be the same woman Moore cried to me about today? I just left. It was our first real argument. I slammed the door and left. I feel like she's betrayed me, but deep down, I don't know what I'd do without her. She didn't fill your shoes, because no one could have, but she completed our lives in a way I thought would never happen. I guess I should apologize, but I don't think I've done anything wrong. He stood up looking down at the grave in the darkness that had settled over the town. I wish I could hear your answers, because you always knew the right thing to say. I miss you, Anna. He turned back toward the house, walking slowly, not in any hurry to see his wife again. When he went inside, he found her setting the table. She'd made a quick meal of fried potatoes with bacon and the leftover corn chowder. The girls were pouring milk into their glasses. Once they were sitting, he looked at Emily and saw her eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. His heart hurt knowing he'd made her cry, but she'd made his more cry. He couldn't let her get away with treating people badly. He wasn't sure how things were done back east, but here everyone respected their elders. He bowed his head and said a quick prayer over the meal. The girls kept looking back and forth between the two of them as if they knew something was wrong, but they weren't sure what. After dinner, he went to the parlor, while she went upstairs to get the laundry gathered up for the morning. While she read a chapter of Little Women to the girls, he sat in the parlor waiting for her to come back down to talk to him. Finally, long after they usually went to bed, he went upstairs to check on her and saw the light was out when he looked under the door. He opened it to find she wasn't there. Where was she? He opened the door to Georgie's room, and Georgie was sound asleep, so he closed it again quietly. He peeked into Abby's room, and there she was. She'd fallen asleep on Abby's bed with her, the book still open on the bed in front of her. He turned down the lamp and left her there, not willing